Good evening, everyone. Buenas tardes. Siéntense por aquí. Welcome to this screening and film discussion in recognition of the 400th anniversary of the publication of the Part 2 of Don Quixote de la Mancha, published in 1615. The Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University, the Observatorio, the Observatory of the Spanish Language and Hispanic Cultures in the United States at Harvard University, and Boston University Hispanic Voices program, Voces Hispánicas, organized this mini film festival, Don Quixote on the Big Screen. This is the fourth and last film on this series this semester. Before this, we had the opportunity to watch the classical The Man of La Mancha, the challenging Lost in La Mancha, both of them screened in Boston University, and the old relic RAFAEL GIL'S Don Quixote de la Mancha. The film today is El Caballero Don Quixote, directed by Manuel Gutiérrez Aragón in 2002. This version is based on the second part of the book of Don Quixote and received some awards, the Goya Award to the Best Photography and the ACE Award from New York to the Best Actor, Juan Luis Gallardo. And by the way, just 1 week ago, the director, Manuel Gutiérrez Aragón, has been elected a full member of the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language in Spain, in representation of the cinema world. So to comment and discuss about the film, we are lucky to have in between us 4 experts on Spanish literature, on Don Quixote and on Miguel de Cervantes. Professor Mary Gaylor, she's professor of Spanish literature at Harvard University. James Iflan is professor of Spanish literature at Boston University. Daniel Aguirre from Harvard University also, and Antonio Arraiza Rivera, teaching fellow and graduate student at Harvard University. But the discussion will be after the screening. And I mean, after the coffee and cookies we are offering after the screening. On behalf of Professor Mary Gaylor and Professor James Iflan, on behalf of the Department of Romance Languages and Literature at Harvard, on behalf of Boston University, and on behalf of the Instituto Cervantes Observatorio, welcome to this to Don Quixote world, and thanks for attending this event. And now, lights, camera, and action. Thank you very much.
Okay. We could invite people to come down, but it doesn't matter. We have microphones. We can pass them. I want to welcome you again. Thank you for coming. We're really happy to have this wonderful panel here. I am here as a moderator, although I probably won't be able to resist making comments. But we have here Daniel Aguirre from the Department of Romance Languages at Harvard, and Professor Jim Iflan from the Department of Romance Languages. Yes, studies, exactly. I can't keep up. People change names. At Harvard, it takes 100 years to change a name. At Boston University, and Antonio Arraiza, the Department of Romance Languages at Harvard also. And they're all eminently qualified to talk about Cervantes and 20th and 21st century film. So I would love to invite Jim Iflan to inaugurate the conversation with observations. How many people were here for other films? And for the RAFAEL GIL, that's right, I remember, yes. I'm glad you came again. So some of us have that point of comparison. Some saw also Man of La Mancha and Terry Gilliam's Lost in La Mancha as well. Believe it or not, we have more of these movies that we hope will continue showing in the fall with encouragement from Francisco Moreno Fernandez, to whom we offer many thanks, and to Victoria for the very wonderful refreshments. The Instituto is an essential partner, and indeed really the driving force behind our getting our act together, shall we say. So Jim, why don't you start?
Thank you, Mary. This is the second time I've seen this this version, and I must admit I'm of two minds about this version. I should point out that I've studied in the Quixote a lot, and I've written a fair amount, and I teach it every other year, and I just got finished teaching it just a few months ago. And of course, when somebody like me watches this movie, you know, we have what we call, I don't know whether we can say this in English, but we have deformación profesional. In other words, you know, Antonio here has the book, right? And I know what's in here. And of course, my dilemma is as I watch this a version like this, I'm constantly saying, well, wait a minute, that's different, that's different. Oh, they just changed the order of things. Oh my God, they threw out a whole, you know, important piece, in my opinion. And of course, here we get back to the whole issue of how you put together, well, the attempts to film the entire work. I mean, we're talking about roughly 1,000 pages. In this case, we're talking about part 2, which is 500 pages. So obviously, anybody who's trying to do an adaptation of the work has to pick and choose what they choose to film. And the last version that we saw, the RAFAEL GIL, I think we all agreed that it was pretty amazing how close the director and the scriptwriter kept to the original. Obviously, a lot of stuff had to go, but that was back in 1948. Back in 1948, you know, he was pretty much trying to be faithful to the order, and it was interesting to see what left. Now, Gutierrez Aragon really, when he looked at just part 2, there are substantial liberties taken, and I'm not against taking liberties. The question for me is, okay, how much is your new version of the work, your retouched version, how well does it hold together as a coherent, autonomous, separate work? And I'm curious, I would actually be, later on, I would be interested to hear from members of the audience who may or may not have, say, memorized part 2 the way I have, what they felt about this reconfiguring of the work. In other words, if you aren't that familiar with the part 2, did this thing make sense? And I think I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a spectator who's not that familiar with the original, and I'm wondering whether, as someone who doesn't know the work that well, whether I would really see a coherent thing or not. And so I thought that there were good. Again, watching the movie, I also sort of thought about, let's say, what we could call the syntax of the original. How much changing of the syntax can you do? Because here we have lots of moments which are pretty good, and I think we are all laughing with the lashes, and you know, he got that pretty well, or at least the spirit of Sancho's flogging well. But there's so many other parts of it that again, you had these very faithful moments, but then they got reconfigured in a way that I don't know whether it made any sense. And then, of course, an issue with the original is very episodic. It's a very episodic work. But I think those of us who have really studied the work, we know that there's an overall logic, and that you can't necessarily move one piece from here to there the way Gutierrez Aragon did. But again, the big question is whether the final product can be judged as something that makes sense as an organic whole, separate from the original. I'm trying not to be super pedantic here as a Quixote expert and saying, oh no, this is different, that's different. I'm really, more than anything, I'm thinking out loud, because I again, as I notice how many, let's say the change in order of the incidents, how much effect did that have? How much is the true order of the work? In other words, how closely had Cervantes thought about this huge number of episodes and huge number of characters? And then the question is, well, if there is a logic there underlying it, which I think a lot of us do think, how free should a director be in flipping things around? Anyway, so that's kind of the other thing, if I may. I think here, I think this is something that other people might be able to react against as well. Excuse me, Don Quixote, it's the flaco and the gordo, right? It's this skinny guy, the tall skinny guy, and the short plump guy. And Don Quixote wasn't particularly tall, and he wasn't particularly skinny. And Sancho, Sancho was not particularly plump. And there's something about having something like that not fit what I have in my head. That bothered me. And Rocinante was galloping around there like what was the Lone? Like the Lone Ranger's horse. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, how can part of the comedy of the work, you can't have a nice, bouncy, powerful horse? It should have been an old nag. And so again, I don't know. I think that in my case, I would like to think I'm not being pedantic about that, but maybe I am. So. It happens in las mejores familias, no? So I will stop at that particular point, and
that's a tough act to follow. But first of all, thank you to the members of the Observatorio Cervantes for organizing this celebration, and to the members of to the panel members for allowing me to share this space of conversation. I was thinking when you pose a question about how does it hold as an adaptation, it made me think a lot that the movie, vis-a-vis the novel, shows the advantages of a medium and the disadvantages of another. And one of the things I like about Murillo's edition and his preliminary study is that he talks about the 1615 Quixote as an exuberant narrative that it's 10 years apart from the first version. It's entering the 17th century, and there's a lot happening, a lot of aesthetic changes. Even the prose, Cervantes' prose, well, please correct me if I'm wrong, but seems more polished. It's more dashing. The whole prose descriptions are dashing. The architecture of the whole narrative is more coherent. And the impression I got after watching Gutierrez Aragon's version that nevertheless, it has its strong points, is that he misses out on a lot of these opportunities. And I'm thinking that it has to do with, well, more prosaic aspects of cinema, of movie making, such as budgetary restrictions, modern technologies. For Cervantes to describe the crowd at Barcelona, and especially the chapters on Barcelona, which do not appear, I think Gutierrez Aragon wasted an extraordinary opportunity there, because it's probably one of the high points of the narrative. When Don Quixote learns about the printing press, where his book is being published, and he's confronted with a book of his own exploits. But we have also Don Antonio Moreno's episode with the talking head, and the whole, it suddenly seems that Cervantes is exploring a world of contraptions, of new technologies, of exotic events, even for Don Quixote. And one of the nice things about the Gutierrez version is that despite the fact that he doesn't have Sancho and Don Quixote get on the ship and get scared and have all the sailors laugh at him, which is something that happens in the book, they nevertheless stand in awe before the sea. But I think it has to do more with what prose allows you to do as opposed to movies and the restrictions that, the material restrictions that don't happen in when you're writing, because you can write freely about anything. You can try to capture a scene or use brilliant rhetorical strategies. And thinking about that, thinking about the prose in Cervantes, one of the things that I did not like about the movie was that there seems to be a lack of timing in certain scenes. They try to do slapstick. It seems that, of course, we cannot do Don Quixote and Sancho without the slapstick humor, without the Punch and Judy type of hitting and falling down and horses running on top of Don Quixote. And nevertheless, they seem somewhat empty, somewhat not dramatized with the same energy as one would perhaps imagine it, or even as Cervantes would have written it. On the other hand, I did like some liberties that Gutierrez Aragon took, because I think they give internal coherence within the format of a movie. The peasant girl that appears at the end, towards the end of the movie, which is something that doesn't happen at all in the second part of Don Quixote, who was supposedly the enchanted Dulcinea, is something that I think works pretty well, because it imparts the screenplay with a certain circularity, internal coherence, which I find was efficient. But yeah, I did miss a lot of the Barcelona scenes. I would have liked more. The movie if Gutierrez Aragon had Don Quixote and Sancho stay a little bit more in the Duke's estate, especially with Altisidora. Where's Altisidora, which is one of the great characters, the Doña Rodriguez, who's but an amazing figure, and especially the interplay between her and Sancho and the whole insults. That would have been a great comic opportunity that nevertheless does not appear in the movie. So for me, it's very revealing what's left out. But again, in terms of how do you transport into visible terms all that Cervantes is doing. So yeah, those are my 2 cents.
It's my turn. Well, thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me here. I'm no expert, but I'm very happy to share this panel with you. Okay, I did not enjoy the movie. But the reason why I did not enjoy it was not that a lot of things were left out, things that we know from the book. I'm gonna try to. When the movie started, the first thing I tried to do was why should a filmmaker try to make a movie based on such a huge book, not just Don Quixote, but just such a huge book, which is impossible to translate into images. I tried to understand the premise behind making the movie, because otherwise you're going to start comparing the book with the movie, and obviously the movie is going to lose. And I think that's unfair to the movie. Even if you don't like the movie, you need to try to understand the premise. And I thought that from the very beginning, one of the premises was that, well, this is the second part of the book, and it's a very interesting starting point. Why? Because the main character has become a literary figure. He's a character on the page, on the written page. And that's where the filmmaker starts. I believe, what he tries to do is he starts creating a Don Quixote in the flesh. And that's, I think, pretty constant throughout the movie. We are seeing Don Quixote, we are smelling, we are hearing conversations about food, about characters in the flesh, which is, you know, part of what movies try to create, this impression that you are actually, you know, seeing someone in the flesh, which is something you don't get in the book. So there's this opposition between the written character and the character in the movie. And that's, I believe, the premise, which is possible if you start the story in the second part of Don Quixote, when he becomes a famous character, and when people start quoting from the book. I mean, he's become a legend from a book. That's the only way you can start making a movie, you know, when you can actually put one character, Don Quixote, you know, on the written page, against Don Quixote in the flesh. And I believe that's a very interesting premise. Whether it works or not, that's a different story. I don't think it quite works, maybe because of the reasons you just explained, but I think the premise is very interesting. And it is very interesting to see how Gutierrez Aragon tries to underline those more physical aspects of the story. For instance, food, which is all over the place. I mean, and it's very interesting how Sancho is always going back to eating, and that's right. That's right. I agree with you that physically the two characters are not very convincing, but the idea behind the movie is very interesting. It doesn't quite work out. That's why I said to begin with that I didn't find it quite convincing, although the idea behind the movie is quite convincing, I think.
I can't resist jumping in. I knew this would happen. Yeah, I think you've all hit on really interesting aspects of the film. The film is so visually gorgeous. It is so visually sumptuous. I kept thinking, you know, Manuel Gutierrez Aragon has been spending a lot of time in the Museo del Prado, a lot of time, or in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, looking at Velázquez scenes from, you know, with serving women in the kitchen and stuff like that. I mean, everything. Even when Don Quixote is on his deathbed, you have a woven coverlet from Murcia, and every shot is like a beautiful. And either they're representational or they're you open with these very abstract panels where textures are juxtaposed. I mean, it's high Spanish decorating taste. It's gorgeous. It's I love it. It's absolutely beautiful. In a way, it was distracting, but it was very, very beautiful. And I agree with you that this is a very physical Don Quixote, which is problematic precisely because of the reasons Jim said. What I was really struck by, and especially comparing it with the RAFAEL GIL film, was that this Quixote, I mean, you got to watch insects crawl over his face and watch his face emerge from behind a burlap cover, and, you know, somehow the abstract becomes the humanized and the personal figure. But time after time, in scenes where he could easily have fit in speeches by Don Quixote, he suppresses the most famous speeches and the most famous parts of the speeches. For example, in the scene of the defeat of Don Quixote, we were just looking at this, we were looking at the end of the novel in our last class today, and, you know, me puedes quitar la vida porque ya me has quitado la honra, and that is suppressed. Why? It's this moment where Don Quixote says, take my life, kill me, because you have deprived me of my honor. And that was suppressed. That was a really striking suppression, because anybody who knows the novel knows that. And the deathbed scene, it gets cut off before Don Quixote can say anything. It's just time after time, the iconic language is suppressed, and that added to the fact that if you don't have a narrator in a movie, I mean, the narrator does with visual, and the filmic narrator works with visual means, right?
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add something to this. Yeah, a lot of text is suppressed, but then some things are, maybe that's the reason why some lines are outstanding. When the end is near, we hear, let's eat our soup. Again, we go back to the physical, the tangible, the physical needs as opposed to the spiritual needs, and that's always underlined. I think the fact that some very important speeches are suppressed help underline those more visual, tangible, physical aspects of the story.
I wanted to say again that in Gil, for those of you who didn't see Gil, it hews very, very close to Cervantes' text and crams speeches into Don Quixote's mouth. I mean, it just, the pace, and of course he's trying to pack, you know, what I listen on CDs to Don Quixote, what is 50 hours of listening into 2 hours of a movie. So you get these big speeches succeeding each other, boom, 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 boom. But, and it's a movie that makes fun of Don Quixote, but at the same time wants to have an iconic Don Quixote who makes heroic pronouncements. And this is a 1948 Quixote, not this one, but the Gil. This is in the high Franco era. We want to know that Don Quixote was benighted, as it were, was mistaken and misled in his inclinations, but that also he's a national icon. It sort of wants to have it both ways. And I think you can see very much the effect of our time, and of 2001 in Spain is a very different time from 1948 in Spain. And so there's a kind of reticence, a rhetorical reticence that, you know, that doesn't want Don Quixote to be this glorious knightly figure. It wants Don Quixote to be real, to be sort of more like Sancho in some ways. I was thinking about the famous pair of chapters in Madariaga's book about the Sanchification of Don Quixote and the Quixotization of Sancho Panza. That is, that they trade roles, but even physically, they seemed to get closer together. Do we have some responses from, or some questions, some observations? Love to know, you know, what you think about it.
Yeah, a brief comment about the director. I confess I was curious about seeing this film because of the director. He was very he was one of the most popular directors in Spain, beginning in the late 60s, 70s, 80s. And I've seen a couple of films, and he tends to make films more realistic in terms of human relations. He even had touched the Civil War in Spain, 1936, things like that, more realistic, as opposed to this character, Don Quixote, who is a man who, according to the book, that his mind is just fantasy, okay, very delusional character. So I was surprised to see that contrast about the work that Gutierrez Aragon has made previously in films as taking and treating this subject the way he does. I was just curious about the film. I'm surprised that this particular director, was involved in making this film because of the nature of the character, the living character.
Jim?
No, I mean, why did he make the film? This was of 2000 what? 2001. So we were only 4 years away from the Cuarto Centenario, the fourth centennial of Part 1 in 2005. The amount of money that was expended in the celebration of the fourth centennial in Spain, it would be unimaginable in this country. The amount. You had Zapatero saying that this is, you know, the fourth centennial is un proyecto de Estado. It's a project of the state of sufficient political importance for us to. I think I think the government put in 30 million euros, and then you had the private sector throwing in. So why does Gutierrez Aragon make a movie? Because it was a huge amount of money flowing around that time, and so okay, I'm not saying he sort of got into it just out of mercenary objectives, but there was a lot of money to do stuff. Yeah, it could be done, but if there are one thing that the other thing that I was wondering about as I watched this, okay, there are a lot of really subtle details that are connected up to the original. That the ideal, I kept wondering who is the ideal spectator for this movie, and because I noticed a bunch of things that only, say, if I may, people like us will note. I mean, like very small, very subtle details that were there. But then you had these huge liberties taken, and I understand why he was taking the huge liberties, but again, you have to wonder whether, let's say, the average viewer has any idea of what he's done with the original. Don Quixote never goes to Toledo to visit the famous insane asylum there. That was a valiant attempt on the part of Gutierrez Aragon to get into the movie the whole problematic of the so-called apocryphal part 2 of Don Quixote, the Avellaneda, which appears there, but not in that scene. I think that was sort of the Caballero del Verde Gabán sort of remixed, right? Okay, with a girl showing the Avellaneda. It was a complete undoing of the original, but at least they got. I'm someone who actually wrote a book on this whole problem. I was happy to see the Avellaneda, the apocryphal part 2, problematic, inserted. But then, I'm left wondering, well, wait a minute. Let's say, since people tend to watch more movies than read books nowadays, and I often have, when you teach a course on Don Quixote, people already come with preconceived notions, and all of the preconceived notions are from film versions, essentially. So I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute, say if some unsuspecting spectator watches this and then has not read that object that is sitting in front of Antonio there, that spectator will come away with the notion that Don Quixote, I mean, just so some of you may or may not know, that in the apocryphal part 2, Don Quixote, in fact, ends up in an insane asylum, okay? Which is a very, let's say, important thing to be pondered about. And okay, so Gutierrez Aragon wants to bring that in, but then he has Don Quixote going to the insane asylum and looking and trying to find this apocryphal version of himself, which was kind of cool, but it was. I mean, it's completely different, and and I wouldn't complain as much if I could be sure that people will actually read the book and not go away with the impression that Don Quixote ever visited Toledo in search of the apocryphal Don Quixote. I mean, I guess where I was going with that is that there's fidelity to very subtle details, and he tries to follow the original in very tiny things, but then he does these flips of gigantic proportions, and I found that to be odd. And the other thing I was going to note, I was listening to the audience. I wanted to see how often people laughed. And to the best of my knowledge, maybe my hearing is going, but I didn't hear that much laughter. And I'm wondering, this is something I always test when I see film versions of Don Quixote, how much laughing is going on among the spectators. because in principle, this is, it has lots of other things in it, but it is a funny book. It's supposed to be, there's supposed to be a lot of laughter. And so if the laughter is not happening, then the take on the work by the director, I think there's something not quite right. Anyway, that's my last 2 cents on that.
I want to make sure people have a chance to say something if they would like to. We have time for maybe a question or a comment, another comment or two. The hour is late, and I know that people have lives. And this is, for us, of course, this is our obsession. But wave a hand in case I don't see it. But we could have a time for a last.
I'm sorry. When you asked the question, who is the ideal spectator for this movie? It made me think about who was this movie made for? It's like another approach to, I don't know if it would be the same question, but another way of thinking about it. And that question just popped into my head, and I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that, if there was any particular, not so much from the spectator side, like you proposed, but from the director and from, who was it?
I can't answer that question. The movie itself, who is it made for? I mean, it's in collaboration. I think one really important answer might lie in the fact that there was collaboration with Radio Televisión Española. You notice that. I mean, this is part of a huge movement that Jim alluded to make this book, which is cultural capital in Spain. This is a huge, huge icon of Spanish culture, but to make it available to the masses, I believe there was a version that was run on television in series as well, related to this. Did you see it, Paco? Did you see it? Yeah. And for example, the Spanish Academy published a wonderful edition that you can actually purchase at Schoenhof's Foreign Books. Huge fat thing with hardcovers, beautiful notes, beautiful print and text. It doesn't even cost $10 now in the United States after it's been imported. So at Schoenhof's, it's been subsidized, and it is this attempt to get this into the hands of everyone.
Just one last detail. Recently, a few weeks ago, I think, Andrés Trapiello, you've heard of this novelist who's an expert in getting into discussions with Francisco Rico about Don Quixote, actually. He just published a modernized version of Don Quixote in current Spanish. So that's another effort to make the book available to the general public. Yeah.
Also, it's going to be very interesting. I'm sure there'll at least be one or more MLA panel sessions on this. And actually, this would be a good activity for the Observatorio. It's not only Trapillo, it's Pérez Reverte. Pérez Reverte was commissioned by the Real Academia Española to do a modernized version of Don Quixote. So it's going to be interesting to see what the verdict is on the Trapillo versus the Pérez Reverte. And who cares what Paco thinks? No, I'm just kidding. No, we're actually friends. So again, going back to what Mary was saying, which was following up on something I said. I mean, it was, for me, all of that activity that was done back in 2005, I had a big question as to how much, in principle, all of those activities should bring people back to this to this object so that they will read it. And what I'm fearful, I was quite not, well, I was not particularly happy to see how the spirit of the celebrations in 2005 were leading in a direction that didn't necessarily translate into a close, let's say, conscientious reading and enjoyment of the text. Because, you know, hey, now if you can see the movie, forget the book. I mean, it's just sit at the cinema and you eat your popcorn, and hey, I know the Quixote. Well, if this ain't the Quixote by any stretch of the imagination. Now, alas, okay, 2005, in my opinion, we had too much money. They didn't know what to do with the money. I've actually written a very long study of what happened to all that money. And this time around, with part two, we don't have enough money. So we're from you know, we have, it's the vacas gordas and the las flacas, and those we've gone to too much money to too little money, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, we're still doing our best, including in this activity here today and other ones around the world, and it'll go on throughout 2015, and then of course in 2016 we'll probably have a gigantic orgy surrounding the death of Cervantes. So prepare for that one. It may be that everybody who has money is holding back until next year so they could do the fourth centennial of the death of Cervantes, which will of course coincide with the fourth centennial of Shakespeare's death. And it's exactly the same date. It's the same date, but not the same day. So prepare for that.
Now, thinking of this in these terms too, I think it's very interesting that Gutiérrez Aragón in 2005 would choose to make a film about the 1615 Quixote. That I wish I knew more about that, because one thing that definitely struck me about this film, it was a very humanized Don Quixote. In a certain way, I think Gutiérrez Aragón has not just bodily, but he has tried to make him sympathetic and, you know, somebody you would find in your own house, not some madman, not some crazy man, but he's also a figure who really has defeat written all over him right from the start. It seemed to me, you know, that you don't have that same brio that he has in the first part, where he goes out and he's going to, you know, conquer the world and slay giants and so on and so forth. And the whole physical presentation of Don Quixote in this one really was more about, let's get Don Quixote to the end, you know, let's put this to bed, as it were. Very interesting as a national project. I mean, to me, it suggests that it's just such a different moment in national history, you know, where one is, all kinds of things are being reevaluated. So we've got to wrap up, Jim. So do you want to?
Just one last, I'm going to pick one last nit, which is Sansón Carrasco, the guy responsible for the defeat of Don Quixote. In the original, he's 23 or 24 years old. And that is important. It's the young guy, smart aleck from Salamanca, which is the Harvard. I was going to do that joke myself. That was the Harvard of 16th, 17th century Spain, and he was a sort of smart-ass Harvard graduate, or Salamanca graduate, and he's the one that's responsible. And so when I say again, you wonder how free should you be to play with the real chemistry of the work, the real logic. And I think having the young guy defeat him is part of the logic. So anyway, Iricho.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you again, Paco, for organizing us. Thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks to panelists. Been great. Let's do it again in the fall.